If you read driving to a job you hate just to pay for things you don't even care about. This video will explain why and why it's not your fault. The consumption trap is not about being irresponsible, lazy, or bad with money. It is about living inside a system that quietly trains people to spend their income in ways that feel normal, justified, and even necessary. From the moment people begin earning a paycheck, they are taught directly and indirectly that spending is proof of success. A bigger salary is expected to come with a bigger lifestyle, and any deviation from that expectation feels like failure. This is how the trap becomes invisible. When everyone around you is doing the same thing, the behavior stops looking dangerous and starts looking like adulthood. At the core of the consumption trap is the idea that wealth is something you display rather than something you build. Cars, phones, clothes, homes, and experiences become signals, not tools. Money flows out almost as fast as it comes in. But because the spending aligns with social norms, it rarely triggers alarm. The bank account empties quietly, month after month, without a clear moment where things feel wrong. On paper, income looks solid. In reality, nothing is accumulating. This gap between appearance and reality is where the trap tightens. The system does not require people to be poor to function. Poverty limits buying power and slows consumption. What the system needs is predictability. Consumers who earn regularly, spend regularly, and borrow regularly are ideal. They maintain steady demand, tolerate long working hours, and remain dependent on income continuity. The consumption trap keeps people functional but fragile. A single disruption, job loss, illness, or emergency can collapse the illusion of stability because there is no buffer underneath the lifestyle. One of the most powerful features of the consumption trap is how it scales with income. When earnings rise, spending rises alongside it. The raise that was supposed to create relief instead becomes justification for upgrades. A slightly nicer car, a larger apartment, more frequent dining out, newer technology. Each decision feels earned and reasonable. None of them feel reckless on their own. Together, they recreate the same financial pressure at a higher income level. This is why two people earning the same salary can live completely different financial lives. One converts income into assets or flexibility, while the other converts it into obligations that demand continued earning. Emotion plays a critical role in keeping the trap intact. Spending provides short-term relief, validation, and pleasure. It offers a sense of progress in a world where real progress often feels slow and abstract. Buying something new creates a temporary feeling of control or reward, especially when work feels draining or unfulfilling. That emotional payoff fades quickly, but the financial commitment remains. Over time, the cycle trains people to associate relief with spending, even as spending becomes the source of long-term stress. Another reason the consumption trap is so effective is that it disguises itself as choice. People believe they are freely deciding how to spend their money, but those decisions are heavily shaped by advertising, social pressure, and cultural narratives. Success is shown, celebrated, and rewarded when it looks a certain way. Frugality is rarely glamorized. Financial restraint is often misinterpreted as failure or lack of ambition. This social framing ensures that opting out of consumption feels isolating, even when it leads to greater stability. The most damaging aspect of the consumption trap is that it consumes time as well as money. When income is fully allocated to maintaining a lifestyle, future options shrink. Career decisions become constrained by payment schedules. Risk becomes dangerous instead of strategic. Freedom turns into a vague concept rather than a real possibility. Life becomes a sequence of obligations managed month to month rather than a structure built deliberately over time. What makes the trap so difficult to escape is that it rarely announces itself as a problem. There is no single catastrophic moment. Instead, there is a slow erosion of financial control masked by normalcy. Bills are paid, appearances are maintained, and stress becomes background noise. The trap succeeds not by force, but by familiarity. It convinces people that this is simply how life works, that exhaustion is normal, and that freedom is reserved for someone else. Credit is often presented as a tool for convenience, opportunity, and progress. But in reality, it functions as one of the most powerful mechanisms for turning future freedom into present obligation. It rarely arrives with warning signs. Instead, it shows up as help. A loan makes a car feel attainable. A credit card makes emergencies feel manageable. Financing turns large purchases into small monthly numbers that appear harmless. This is how credit gains trust. By the time its true cost becomes visible, the dependency is already formed. At its core, credit is the sale of future time. Every dollar borrowed represents hours, days, or years of labor that have not yet happened. When interest is added, even more future effort is required just to return to zero. This is why credit feels light in the present but heavy in the long term. The burden is delayed, spread out, and hidden behind minimum payments and friendly statements. What looks like flexibility is actually a commitment that narrows future choices. The danger of credit is not only the interest charged, but the way it reshapes behavior. Once payments exist, income is no longer fully yours. A portion of every paycheck is already spoken for before it arrives. This creates psychological pressure to maintain stability at all costs. Jobs become harder to leave. Risks become harder to take. Even small financial disruptions feel threatening because the margin for error has been removed. Credit transforms income from a tool into a requirement. Monthly payments are particularly effective at disguising the true cost of borrowing. By focusing attention on what can be afforded per month, total cost fades into the background. A purchase stops being evaluated by its value and starts being justified by its payment size. This framing encourages larger, more frequent borrowing because the immediate impact feels manageable. Over time, multiple small payments combine into a fixed financial weight that limits mobility and increases stress. Credit also creates a false sense of progress. Making payments feels productive, as if something is being built. In reality, most consumer debt builds nothing. Cars lose value. Electronics become obsolete. Experiences fade into memory. Yet the payments continue long after the benefit is gone. This disconnect between effort and reward is what makes credit so draining. Energy is spent maintaining the past instead of investing in the future. Another layer of the credit trap is how deeply it is normalized and rewarded. Credit scores are treated as markers of responsibility, even though they measure borrowing behavior, not financial health. Someone with significant debt but consistent payments is seen as more trustworthy than someone who avoids borrowing altogether. This inversion of values reinforces the idea that participation in debt is not only acceptable, but expected. Opting out begins to look abnormal rather than prudent. Interest amplifies every mistake. It ensures that poor decisions linger longer and cost more. Even modest interest rates compound over time, quietly transferring wealth from borrowers to lenders. This transfer is steady and automatic, requiring no effort from the system and constant effort from the individual. The longer debt exists, the more expensive it becomes, not just in money, but in lost opportunity. Perhaps the most overlooked effect of credit is how it reduces imagination. When future income is already allocated, it becomes difficult to envision alternative paths. Entrepreneurship feels risky. Career changes feel irresponsible. Freedom becomes theoretical instead of practical. Credit does not just finance purchases. It finances compliance. It keeps people aligned with predictable routines because unpredictability threatens repayment. Credit does not fail people suddenly. It succeeds at exactly what it is designed to do: keep consumption high and dependence steady. The chains are not visible because they are spaced out over time and disguised as convenience. What begins as a solution quietly becomes a structure that governs decisions, limits flexibility, and trades long-term freedom for short-term comfort. Large purchases have a way of feeling permanent and meaningful, as if they represent milestones rather than transactions. A new car, a house, a fully furnished home, or a carefully curated wardrobe can feel like proof that life is moving forward. These moments are celebrated socially and reinforced culturally, which makes questioning them feel unnecessary or even foolish. Yet beneath the surface, many of these purchases quietly drain long-term wealth while giving very little in return beyond short-lived satisfaction. The problem is not that these items exist or that people want them. The problem is how they are framed and financed. Most big purchases are presented as rewards for hard work, while their financial consequences are minimized or ignored. Monthly payments become the focus, allowing the total cost to fade into the background. Over time, this framing turns expensive decisions into routine ones, even when they undermine financial stability. Cars are one of the clearest examples of this dynamic. They are marketed as symbols of success, freedom, and identity. Yet they are among the fastest depreciating assets most people will ever buy. The moment a car is driven off the lot, its value begins to fall. Despite this, people often finance vehicles for years, paying interest on something that is worth less with each passing month. The financial loss is not only the difference between purchase price and resale value, but the opportunity cost of what that money could have become if it had been invested instead. Housing is often treated as an unquestionable investment, but in practice it functions primarily as shelter with a long-term financing plan attached. Mortgages stretch over decades, and in the early years, most payments go toward interest rather than ownership. While property values can rise, the cost of maintenance, taxes, insurance, and interest significantly reduce real returns. For many, frequent moving resets the mortgage clock, ensuring that banks capture the bulk of the benefit while owners build equity slowly. Furniture and clothing operate on a similar psychological level, though with less financial visibility. These purchases are driven by aesthetics, status, and social comparison. A couch, a table, or a jacket is rarely evaluated based on utility alone. Instead, it becomes part of a narrative about taste, success, or belonging. The financial impact of these items is often underestimated because each purchase feels isolated. In reality, they accumulate into substantial outflows that provide no lasting return. What makes these purchases particularly damaging is how they disguise trade-offs. Buying something expensive does not just use money. It uses potential. Every dollar committed to a depreciating or non-productive asset is a dollar that cannot grow elsewhere. Over time, these decisions shape the entire financial trajectory of a life. They determine whether income creates freedom or merely sustains appearances. Another overlooked cost is the emotional weight of ownership. Large purchases often come with ongoing obligations. Maintenance, repairs, insurance, and replacement all demand attention and money. Instead of simplifying life, possessions can complicate it. The need to protect, upgrade, or replace them becomes a background concern, subtly increasing stress and reducing flexibility. Social reinforcement makes these choices difficult to challenge. Driving an older car or living in a modest home is often interpreted as lack of ambition rather than intentional restraint. This misinterpretation pressures people to spend in order to maintain credibility or self-worth. The result is a cycle where financial decisions are shaped more by perception than by purpose. Over time, the accumulation of these purchases creates a lifestyle that requires constant income to sustain. Wealth becomes something that looks good but feels fragile. The danger is not immediate failure, but long-term stagnation. Money flows out faster than it can work, and progress is replaced by maintenance. What appears to be a series of personal choices is often a predictable outcome of a system that rewards consumption and discourages patience. Recurring expenses rarely feel threatening because they arrive in small, predictable amounts. A few dollars here, a monthly charge there, each one seemingly insignificant on its own. Over time, however, these payments accumulate into a fixed structure that quietly dictates how much income is required just to maintain normal life. This structure is powerful because it is subtle. Unlike a large purchase, recurring expenses do not trigger hesitation. They slide into routines and remain largely unquestioned. Subscriptions are the most visible form of this pattern. Entertainment platforms, music services, fitness memberships, apps, cloud storage, and delivery programs all promise convenience and enjoyment for a modest monthly fee. Because the cost is spread out, the decision to subscribe feels easier than the decision to buy outright. The problem is not any single subscription, but the sheer number that accumulate over time. Each one represents a small claim on future income, and together they form a significant financial obligation. What makes recurring expenses particularly effective at trapping people is their permanence. Once a payment becomes part of the monthly budget, it is rarely reevaluated. It blends into the background, becoming as expected as rent or utilities. This normalization removes friction from spending decisions and makes it harder to reduce expenses when circumstances change. Cutting recurring payments often feels like giving something up, even when the benefit has long faded. Beyond subscriptions, recurring costs also appear in daily habits. Regular dining out, premium convenience services, and frequent impulse purchases may not be labeled as subscriptions, but they function the same way. They create predictable outflows that depend on continued income. Because these habits are tied to comfort or routine, they can feel essential, even when they are not. Over time, they raise the baseline cost of living without increasing long-term satisfaction. The psychological impact of recurring expenses is significant. Each payment represents a small loss of control over future time. When income is already allocated, options shrink. The ability to respond to change becomes limited because flexibility has been traded for convenience. This is how recurring expenses quietly reinforce dependency. They ensure that a certain level of income is always required, which in turn shapes career choices, stress levels, and tolerance for dissatisfaction. Another hidden cost of recurring expenses is their effect on awareness. Because the amounts are small, they rarely trigger reflection. People are far more likely to think carefully about a large one-time purchase than about dozens of small monthly charges. This asymmetry allows significant financial leakage to continue unnoticed. Over years, the total cost of these payments can rival or exceed major purchases, yet they remain largely invisible. Recurring expenses also reinforce the illusion that enjoyment and fulfillment must be purchased. When entertainment, relaxation, and social connection are consistently tied to spending, it becomes difficult to imagine alternatives. Free or low-cost activities begin to feel inferior, even when they offer greater satisfaction. This conditioning keeps spending habits intact and discourages experimentation with simpler ways of living. As these payments accumulate, they form a financial floor that cannot easily be lowered. This floor determines how much income is required just to stand still. Any reduction in earnings becomes stressful, not because life has become unaffordable in absolute terms, but because commitments have multiplied. This is how recurring expenses turn into quiet enforcers, maintaining the status quo without overt pressure. Over time, the real cost of recurring expenses is not the money itself, but the constraint they place on choice. They convert flexibility into obligation and turn income into a necessity rather than a resource. The result is a lifestyle that feels full but constrained, comfortable but fragile, and stable only as long as nothing changes. Freedom in financial life rarely arrives as a sudden breakthrough. It is not a jackpot, a promotion, or a dramatic windfall. Instead, it grows quietly from a shift in how money is understood and used. The most powerful change happens when spending stops being automatic and starts becoming intentional. This shift transforms money from something that disappears into routines into something that actively builds control, stability, and choice over time. At the center of this transformation is the idea that money is not just currency, but stored effort. Every dollar represents time, energy, and attention that has already been spent earning it. When that dollar is wasted, the effort behind it is wasted as well. When it is used intentionally, it becomes a tool that can reduce future effort. This is where the idea of money working for you becomes real rather than motivational language. Intentional spending reduces the need for constant income growth. Most people assume that earning more is the primary solution to financial stress. In reality, stress often comes from how much is required to maintain a certain lifestyle. When expenses are high and fixed, income becomes fragile. When expenses are lower and flexible, income gains power. The gap between what you earn and what you need creates breathing room. And breathing room creates freedom. This freedom shows up first as psychological relief. Knowing that fewer dollars are required each month reduces background anxiety. Decisions no longer feel as urgent or desperate. The mind becomes clearer because it is not constantly calculating how to keep everything running. This clarity has value on its own. independent of net worth or account balances. Over time, intentional spending creates momentum. Money that is not consumed by lifestyle inflation begins to accumulate. At first, this accumulation may feel slow and unimpressive. There is no visible status symbol attached to it. Yet this quiet accumulation is powerful because it compounds. Each saved dollar can generate returns, and each return adds to the next cycle of growth. This process is gradual, but it is consistent, and consistency is what builds lasting wealth. The concept of opportunity cost becomes central at this stage. Every spending decision is also an investing decision, whether consciously or not. Choosing consumption means choosing not to invest. Choosing simplicity means choosing growth. This awareness changes how purchases are evaluated. Instead of focusing only on immediate satisfaction, attention shifts to long-term impact. The future becomes part of the decision-making process. As financial pressure decreases, options increase. Options are the true measure of wealth. The ability to leave an unhealthy job, to take time off, to relocate, or to pursue a lower-paying but more meaningful path all depend on having margin. Margin is created when income exceeds intentional expenses. This margin turns money into leverage rather than obligation. Another powerful effect of intentional spending is resilience. Life is unpredictable, and financial shocks are inevitable. When expenses are lean and savings are present, disruptions become manageable. They no longer threaten identity or stability. This resilience reduces fear, and reduced fear leads to better decisions. People with financial margin are less likely to panic, borrow impulsively, or accept unfavorable conditions out of desperation. Intentional spending also reshapes identity. Instead of defining success by visible consumption, success becomes associated with autonomy and control. This internal definition is harder for external forces to manipulate. Marketing loses some of its power because validation is no longer purchased. Satisfaction becomes more durable because it is rooted in capability rather than appearance. Over time, this approach creates a compounding loop. Lower spending increases savings. Savings increase investment potential. Investments generate growth. Growth increases options. Options reduce stress and improve decision-making. Improved decisions reinforce intentional behavior. Each cycle strengthens the next, and the system becomes self-supporting. Ultimately, the value of intentional spending is not austerity or restriction. It is alignment. Money begins to serve actual priorities rather than imagined ones. Life becomes simpler in structure but richer in possibility. The reward is not just a higher net worth, but a life with fewer constraints and more choice. This is the quiet path to financial independence, built not through extremes, but through consistent, deliberate control over where effort is stored and how it is used. If this changed how you see money, check out my other videos on escaping debt, building real wealth, and breaking free from the system. Subscribe and start breaking the chains.